When the Gecko brothers stumble into the titty twister, they're expecting strippers and tequila, not a full-blown nest of ancient serpent vampires with serious anger management issues. The movie doesn't hold your hand with exposition dumps, but if you pay attention to that gnarly-ass Aztec temple vibe of the bar's interior, you start piecing together that these aren't your typical Dracula wannabes. These creatures, later expanded as Quilibras in the franchise lore, trace back to Mesoamerican roots, which explains why they look less like pale aristocrats and more like something that crawled straight out of a nightmare involving rattlesnakes. The transformation scene where Santa Nico Pandemonium and her crew reveal their true form is genuinely unsettling because they don't just grow fangs. They morph into these reptilian nightmares with elongated faces, forked tongues, and a hunger that makes normal vampires look polite. Getting bitten doesn't just turn you into one of them, it rewires your entire biology into something serpentine and monstrous, which is why Sex Machine's gradual transformation throughout the siege is both tragic and straight up kinda gross. The temple architecture and ritualistic setup highlight these Quilibras aren't just random monsters, but part of an organized bloodline that's been operating for potentially thousands of years, treating human victims as both food and potential recruits for their serpent army. The fact that they've disguised their temple as a trashy biker bar right on the Mexican border shows a calculated predatory intelligence positioning themselves perfectly to prey on criminals and drifters who won't be missed by authorities or their families. The survivors quickly learn that standard vampire rules still apply. Sunlight will fry them. Stakes through the heart work beautifully, and anything blessed or cross-shaped becomes a weapon if you're creative enough. Watching the group create tools out of thin air throughout the night, like a makeshift crossbow, holy water-filled condoms, and literally anything they can sanctify, is both hilarious and genius. There's no cure, no redemption arc for the infected, just survival until sunrise, which adds real weight to every bite and scratch during the chaos. The implication that this bar has been running for centuries as a feeding ground makes you wonder how many travelers vanished on that desolate highway before the geckos accidentally stumble into what amounts to a vampire franchise operation disguised as roadside entertainment. The Vampire Diaries doesn't mess around when it comes to building an intricate vampire mythology that actually makes you care about the rules. The whole bloodline starts with a desperate mother named Esther who watches her son get killed by werewolves and decides the solution was to turn her entire family into unkillable predators using dark magic, doppelganger blood from a woman named Tatia, and a white oak tree that would ironically become their only weakness. The transition process is brutal in its simplicity. You need vampire blood in your system when you die. Then you wake up in this horrible limbo state where you have maybe a day to drink human blood or you just die for real, which creates some genuinely heartbreaking moments when characters struggle with completing the transition. What makes this series fascinating is the lineage concept, where every vampire ever turned traces back to one of the original siblings, meaning if you manage to kill an original with white oak, you're not just taking out one ancient vampire, but potentially wiping out thousands of their descendants in a cascading extinction event that makes every stake incredibly political. The power dynamics get even more interesting because originals can compel other vampires while regular vampires can only mess with human minds, unless those humans are drinking vervain, which acts like a psychic firewall and also burns vampires on contact. The daylight ring system is clever because it gives vampires freedom, but also creates vulnerability since the witch who enchanted your ring can basically flip your off switch whenever they want, turning your jewelry into an actual death sentence. Standard vampire weaknesses apply. Wood through the heart drops a regular vampire permanently. Decapitation and heart extraction work great for the non-original crowd. And the invitation rule means you can't just barge into someone's house unless you're asked in, which creates some hilarious standoffs at doorways. The werewolf bite mechanic adds another layer because their venom is essentially a slow, agonizing death sentence for vampires, with the only cure being blood from Klaus, the original hybrid who's part vampire and part werewolf, making him a walking pharmacy that everyone needs to stay on good terms with. The existence of the cure, created by the witch Quetzaya, throws a wrench into everything because it actually strips away vampirism and makes someone human again, and the cured person's blood becomes a transferable cure, which means everyone's either hunting it or running from it, depending on whether they want mortality back. This isn't a universe where vampire rules are simple suggestions. They're ironclad laws that drive every major conflict, alliance, and betrayal across 8 seasons. Blade drops you into a badass world where vampires aren't hiding in castles, but running multinational corporations and underground blood clubs while humanity walks around completely clueless. The Vampire Nation operates like a shadow government with its own hierarchy, where purebloods born as vampires look down on the turned humans like second-class citizens, and houses like the House of Erebus enforce their versions of the masquerade to keep humans in the dark. Blade himself exists as the ultimate anomaly, basically him before the word was popular. A damn pure who got all the vampire strengths when his pregnant mother was bitten, but none of the weaknesses, making him the daywalker that both sides fear and need. The turning process is straightforward vampire bite mechanics. The film treats vampirism as a biological condition rather than just supernatural curse, with transformed humans experiencing complete physiological rewiring that makes them vulnerable to specific chemicals and elemental triggers. The vampire weaknesses in this universe read like a weapons manual. UV light and direct sunlight will literally make them combust in a badass fashion in seconds. Silver burns them on contact. Garlic and its derivatives are toxic to their biology, and the film introduces EDTA, an anticoagulant that essentially makes their blood explode from the inside out, and one of the most spectacular kill methods ever put on screen. Watching Deacon Frost's crew detonate like blood-filled water balloons when injected with the stuff never gets old, and shows the franchise treats vampire biology as something that can be exploited scientifically. The vampire community experiments consistently with technology and chemistry to overcome their sunlight problem, developing specialized gear and treatments, but they remain fundamentally photosensitive creatures who can't escape their core weaknesses no matter how advanced they get. Blade's serum is interesting because it's not a cure for vampirism, but a suppressant for his inherited bloodlust, meaning he's constantly managing his hybrid nature through biochemistry rather than willpower alone, which adds real stakes to every fight when his supply runs low. The lack of any general cure reinforces that vampirism in this world is permanent transformation, not some reversible infection. So once you're turned, you're locked into that existence with all its powers and fatal vulnerabilities. Underworld throws out that supernatural playbook and gives you an awesome sci-fi origin story where vampires and lichens aren't cursed by magic, but infected by a mutated virus that traces back to one man, Alexander Corvinus, who survived a plague in the medieval period and developed an immunity that fundamentally altered his bloodline. His 2 sons got the short end of the stick. Marcus was bitten by a bat, becoming the first vampire, while his other son, William, was bitten by a wolf, the first lichen, turning the entire vampire-werewolf war into a century-long family feud over divergent viral evolution. The transmission works like any virus, spreading through bites that inject either the vampire or lichen strain into a victim's bloodstream, and the film introduces the hybrid concept through Michael Corbin, whose rare bloodline can accept both strains simultaneously and create something exponentially more powerful than either species alone. The vampire abilities are your standard superhuman package of speed, strength, and healing, but they're treated as biological enhancements from the virus rather than mystical powers, which makes the science feel grounded even when Celine is doing parkour off buildings in a leather catsuit. Sunlight and UV radiation are absolutely lethal to vampires in this universe, causing immediate cellular breakdown that looks like spontaneous combustion, and the Death Dealers have weaponized this vulnerability by developing UV ammunition and portable sunlight lamps that turn vampire hunting into high-tech warfare. What's interesting is that silver doesn't affect vampires here at all. It's specifically a lichen weakness, which shows how the film distinguishes between the 2 viral strains and their unique biological vulnerability. The vampire governance structure operates through the Elder system, where 3 ancient vampires take turns ruling for centuries while the other 2 hibernate, with power transfers happening through ritual blood exchanges that feel more like corporate secession than supernatural tradition. And you've got vampires like Victor who refuse to give up power when their turn ends, leading to the conspiracy and assassination plot spots that drive the entire first film. There's no cure for either condition because the Corvinus strain fundamentally rewrites your DNA at a cellular level, meaning once you're infected, you're permanently altered into a new species, which raises the stakes for every transformation and makes Michael's hybrid status something that can't be undone or reversed. Ryan Coogler's Sinners takes classic vampire folklore and plants it firmly in Jim Crow era Mississippi, where the monsters aren't just bloodsuckers, but a walking metaphor for colonial domination, draining the life out of black communities in the Delta. The vampires here play by old school rules that feel refreshingly strict. Sunlight will incinerate them instantly, and they absolutely cannot cross a threshold without an invitation, which creates genuine tension and critical moments when characters realize their homes aren't the only safe zones left. Transmission works through the standard bite mechanic, but this is one thing that the movie did different. Killing the master vampire doesn't magically cure everyone that's turned, meaning once you're converted, you're stuck that way permanently with no lineage loopholes or magical reversals to save you. The Vampire Coven operates with this creepy hive mind coordination where you can sense and communicate with each other telepathically while still maintaining their individual personalities, and the higher tier vampires can straight up fly, which makes them exponentially more terrifying when they're hunting you through the Mississippi backwoods. The lead vampire is Irish, which Coogler uses to draw a direct line between European colonial expansion and vampiric consumption, positioning these creatures as literal embodiments of extractive foreign powers that come to America to feed off marginalized communities. Against them stands Choctaw vampire hunters who carry generational knowledge about threshold rules, garlic's repelling properties, and the reliable kill methods of staking and sunrise exposure. The culture clash between Irish vampires and indigenous hunters adds layers to the lore because it frames vampire hunting not as random monster slaying, but as resistance against an invasive predator species that followed colonizers across the Atlantic. The Delta Blues setting amplifies everything because you got vampires hunting in a landscape already suffocated by Jim Crow violence, creating this horrible overlap where supernatural and systemic oppression becomes indistinguishable threats. True Bloods comes at the vampire genre with a simple question: what happens when vampires don't have to hide anymore? The invention of True Blood, a synthetic blood substitute sold in convenience stores like energy drinks, gives vampires the option to stop hunting humans and step into the light as a legislative species with legal rights, political structures, and even their own monarchies that govern territories across America. When someone gets turned in this universe, it's not a quick bite and done deal. It's a full ceremonial process where the maker drains you completely, feeds you their blood, and then literally buries you both in the ground overnight so you can rise together the next evening as a newborn vampire bound to your creator for potentially centuries. We see this with Jessica's traumatic turning, where Bill has to bury her after draining her, and she claws her way out of the dirt, confused and terrified, still wearing her prom dress from the night she died. Vampire blood itself becomes this massive cultural phenomenon because humans discover that drinking it grants temporary superhuman abilities, healing wounds instantly, and works better than any drug on the market. So you got entire criminal operations building around draining vampires and selling their blood in vials. This potent ability sets true vampires apart from the rest because they can lock eyes with humans and rewrite their memories or plant commands, like when Bill glares at Sookie's grandmother to forget she ever saw him, which makes vampires incredibly dangerous because they can feed and erase all evidence without leaving a damn witness. The fairy blood loophole creates chaos when vampires realize that drinking from characters like Sookie can let them walk in daylight temporarily, leading to a feeding frenzy where every vampire in Louisiana wants a taste of her to experience sunshine again after centuries in darkness. Stakes cause that signature True Blood explosion where vampires detonate into gore and blood when pierced through the heart, which happens so frequently it becomes almost cartoonish. The introduction of Hep V in later seasons transforms vampires from apex predators into victims of a vampire-specific plague that spreads through contaminated human blood, turning infected vampires into rotting, feral versions of themselves covered in black veins and oozing sores, which is kind of ironic. Sarah Newland becoming the walking cure for Hep V creates this desperate manhunt where she's simultaneously the most wanted and most protected human alive because her blood can save the entire vampire species from extinction. The classic Buffy the Vampire Slayer builds its vampire mythology on a genuinely dark foundation where vampires aren't just infected humans, but literally demon-possessed corpses walking around in stolen bodies. When someone gets turned, they're drained completely and then fed vampire blood before dying. But here's what makes the show different. The human soul leaves the body entirely, and a demon soul moves in to animate the corpse, which means the person you knew is actually gone, and what's left is just a demon wearing their face and memories like a costume. We see this brutal reality when Jesse gets turned in the first episode, and Xander has to stake his childhood best friend, realizing that Jesse is truly dead even though his body is still walking around cracking jokes. The searing process creates this tragic moment throughout the series, like when Angel loses his soul and becomes Angelus again, proving that without that human soul anchoring him, he's just a sadistic demon who remembers being Angel but doesn't care about any of it. Vampires in the Buffyverse have superhuman strength and speed, and their faces morph into this rigid, yellow-eyed vamp face, we'll just call it, when they're feeding or fighting, which serves as a visual reminder that they're demons wearing human masks. The show uses every classic vampire weakness in its arsenal. Sunlight turns them to dust instantly. Stakes through the heart cause immediate dusting that leaves nothing but clothes behind. Decapitation works, fires incinerate them, and holy water burns their skin like acid, which makes for some gnarly ass creative combat when Buffy weaponizes water guns filled with holy water during fights. The invitation rule creates real tension because vampires physically cannot enter a private residence without being explicitly invited inside, and if someone rescinds the invitation, like Buffy does to Angel after he loses his soul, the house itself magically ejects the vampires across the threshold like the eject button in a fighter pilot jet. There's no cure for standard vampirism because the human soul is gone and the demon has full control, though the show explores magical exceptions like Angel and Spike, who get their souls restored through curses or trials, turning them into these tortured hybrids who have demon strength but human guilt. The Old One's mythology shows that the first vampires come from ancient pureblood demons, meaning every vampire in Sunnydale is a distant descendant of these primordial monsters, which explains why the Master looks so monstrous compared to younger vampires who still retain some of those more human features. Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula gives us an origin story that's equal parts romance and damnation, where Vlad the Impaler literally renounces God after his wife Elisabetta throws herself from the castle walls believing he died in battle, and in his rage he stabs the cross with his sword until blood pours from the chapel walls and he drinks it, sealing a dark pact that transforms him into an immortal monster. The film stays mostly faithful to Stoker's original transmission rules, where victims must be bitten multiple times and forced to drink the vampire's blood to complete the turning, which we see with Lucy's gradual transformation as Dracula feeds on her night after night until she finally dies and rises as a vampire bride. Dracula's powers feel almost godlike in their scope. He shapeshifts into wolves, bats, rats, and even mist to slip through cracks and under doors, controls storms and fog to cloak his movements, and casts no reflection in mirrors, which becomes a critical plot point when Harker realizes his host's true nature. The dependency on native Transylvanian soil grounds Dracula's immortality into a literal connection to his homeland, forcing him to transport boxes of his own earth to England so he has a safe place to rest during the day, which gives Van Helsing's team a tactical advantage when they start hunting down and destroying his soil stashes across London. Sunlight in this adaptation sits in an interesting middle ground, where it clearly weakens and limits Dracula during the day, making him appear as an old man rather than the powerful creature he becomes at night, though it doesn't instantly incinerate him like modern vampire lore would suggest. Religious symbols, garlic, and holy water all serve as effective repellents that physically pain him, creating barriers the hunters use to trap and corner him, and the invitation rule means he can't simply storm into homes but must be welcomed across the threshold first. And after looking at all the movies and shows, I think this is one of the first renditions we see of that rule. The final kill sequence requires both a stake through the heart and decapitation, with Quincy Morris driving a Bowie knife into Dracula's heart while Jonathan slashes his throat, and only then the curse breaks and Dracula's face returns to human peace as it crumbles to dust, finally released from centuries of damnation. 30 Days of Night strips away all the romantic vampire nonsense and gives you straight up apex predators who speak their own creepy ass language, hunt in coordinated packs, and view humans the same way we view cattle at a slaughterhouse. These vampires aren't interested in seduction or turning victims into companions. None of that shit. They're running an extermination operation in Barrow, Alaska during the month-long polar night when the sun won't rise to stop them. And their leader, Marlowe, explicitly orders his pack to kill everyone and leave no survivors to maintain their species' secrecy. This would be a worst case scenario situation for regular people running from vampires. The turning process exists, but it's deliberately rare because the vampires have strict population control, though we see Eben inject himself with infected blood in a desperate gambit to gain vampire strength and save the remaining survivors, showing that transmission works through getting vampire blood into your system. What makes the creatures in this movie next level is how they move and communicate. They screech and click in this constructed language that sound like predatory birds mixed with grinding metal. They coordinate ambushes with military precision and display animalistic features like rows of sharp teeth like sharks, blackened eyes, and clawed hands that they use to rip through doors and flesh with equal ease. The film shows them as pack hunters who use tactics like herding survivors into kill zones, cutting off escape routes, and posted sentries to prevent anyone from reaching communication equipment or weapons. Sunlight remains their only reliable weakness, and when it finally returns after 30 days, the vampires incinerate almost instantly, with their skin blackening and crackling as they burst into flames and collapse into ash. Decapitation works throughout the film as the go-to kill method, with survivors using axes and saws to separate heads from bodies when they manage to isolate individual vampires from the pack. The vampire leadership's obsession with maintaining secrecy by wiping out the entire town shows they operate under their own version of the masquerade, understanding that humanity discovering their existence would trigger an extinction level response they couldn't survive despite their superior physical abilities. Queen of the Damned introduces Aaliyah as Akasha, the literal mother of all vampires, the original source from which every bloodsucker in existence descends, and the film shows how her awakening after 6,000 years of sleep threatens to reshape the entire vampire world under her genocidal vision. The origin traces back to ancient Egypt, where Akasha and her husband Enkidu became the first vampires when the spirit Amel fused with Akasha after she was mortally wounded, though the film simplifies this mythology while keeping her status as the progenitor whose existence sustains the entire species. Transmission happens through the dark gift, where a vampire drains a human and feeds them their blood in return, but the power level you inherit depends heavily on your maker's age and proximity to Akasha herself, which is why Lestat became exponentially stronger after drinking directly from the source. Ancient vampires like Marius display abilities that dwarf younger vampires, moving faster than the eye can track, crushing stones with bare hands, and surviving damage that would obliterate the more weaker vampires, while Akasha herself seems nearly indestructible, with powers that include pyrokinesis and the ability to basically sacrifice and kill other vampires with her mind. The Rice universe throws out traditional vampire rules entirely. Garlic does nothing, crosses are meaningless decorations, and stakes are just annoying splinters that won't kill anyone, leaving only fire and sunlight as legitimate threats that can actually destroy a vampire's body beyond its healing capabilities. Akasha's downfall comes not from sunlight or holy weapons, but from her ancient vampires collectively draining her blood until she's destroyed, which the elders do to stop her to exterminate 90% of the male population and rule over humanity as a blood goddess. Twilight rewrites vampire lore from the ground up by ditching curses, demons, and religious mythology in favor of a venom-based biological transformation that turns humans into practically indestructible granite-type structures with superhuman abilities. When someone gets bitten, the venom spreads through the bloodstream cell by cell over 2 to 3 agonizing days, which we see with Bella's transformation, where she's literally burning from the inside as the venom rewrites her entire cellular structure. And the only way to stop it is for a vampire to suck the venom out immediately before it spreads too far. That sounded crazy. The transformation produces these cold stone hard bodies with skin that has a crystalline structure, which is why Edward sparkles like a diamond when sunlight hits him in that infamous meadow scene, completely removing sunlight as a vampire's weakness and turning it into just an inconvenient spotlight that reveals what they are. These vampires don't need sleep and possess strength that lets them rip trees out of the ground and speed that makes them blur across landscapes faster than the human eye can track. Plus, some develop additional gifts like Alice's precognitive visions, Edward's mind reading, or Bella's mental shield that blocks psychic attacks. The Volturi serve as a vampire royalty and enforcers who maintain secrecy by executing any vampire who exposes the species to humans, which is why Aro and his guard show up ready to destroy the Cullens when they think Renesmee is an immortal child. Killing a Twilight vampire requires complete dismemberment, followed by burning the pieces because their bodies are so durable that even severed limbs can theoretically reattach. And the book describes this process in gruesome detail, while the movie shows it visually in Breaking Dawn Part 2's battle sequence where Jasper gets beheaded and Carlisle gets decapitated before we realize it's all Alice's vision. Traditional vampire deterrents like garlic, crosses, holy water, and wooden stakes are completely useless because there's no demonic or supernatural curse to counter, just biology that human weapons can't penetrate. Newborn vampires are exceptionally dangerous because they retain their human blood in their system for roughly a year, giving them extra strength that makes them more powerful than century-old vampires, which is why Victoria builds an army of newborns to attack the Cullens in Eclipse, though the books spend more time explaining the biological mechanisms while the movies focus on the visual spectacle of their wild, uncontrolled fighting style. The AMC adaptation of Interview with the Vampire stays faithful to Anne Rice's mythology, where vampirism isn't a curse but the dark gift, an ancient bloodline that traces back thousands of years to the original vampires Akasha and Nanika, with power and abilities concentrating as you move up the generational ladder towards the source. The turning process requires the maker to drain their victim to the edge of death and then feed them vampire blood in exchange, which we see in both the 1994 film and the AMC series, though the show lingers on the violence and intimacy of Louis' transformation, while the movie keeps it relatively brief and romantic, with Brad Pitt's Louis waking up disoriented in his coffin versus Jacob Anderson's Louis experimenting the sensory overload of his new existence in visceral detail. What makes the Rice universe fascinating is how vampire abilities evolve with age. Younger vampires like Louis have enhanced strength, speed, and senses, but ancient vampires develop what they call the Great Gifts, including the Cloud Gift for flight, the Fire Gift for pyrokinesis, and the Mind Gift for telepathy and telekinesis, which the AMC series explores more thoroughly than the film by showing Armin's mental abilities and hinting at powers Louis hasn't even begun to process. The 1994 movie focuses primarily on the emotional horror and Louis' guilt over killing, barely scratching the surface of the deeper Akasha mythology that would come in The Queen of the Damned, while the AMC show weaves in references to the ancient bloodlines and coven politics from the start, positioning Louis and Claudia's story within a much larger supernatural hierarchy. The maker-vessel bond works the same in both versions, creating a psychological and sometimes physical connection where makers can sense their progeny, but the series amplifies this into a toxic codependency between Louis and Lestat that spans decades of separation and reunion. Sunlight and fire remain the only legitimate threats across all Rice adaptations, with both the film and show demonstrating that crosses, garlic, and stakes are useless because these vampires are biologically transformed beings rather than demonic possessions. The movie shows Claudia's death by sunlight exposure as almost peaceful, her body crumbling to ash in the dawn, while the series depicts sunlight exposure as excruciatingly painful when Claudia tests her limits.